Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 71 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. A word of warning before we launch into our episode today. There are a few times when the recording of our conversation is not as clear as we would like it to be. My guest, Lynette Linton, joined me from her lively office at the Bush Theatre in London. And in the way of these things, we were subject to the vagaries of our online connection. I hope that you will bear with us, however, because we had lots of fun talking about a fascinating play. The curtain rises on the working kitchen of a truck stop diner on the outskirts of the town of Reading, Pennsylvania, in the heart of what is known as the American Rust Belt. A man in his 40s is making a sandwich, meticulously applying the final garnish with a care that is incongruous to the setting. As he does so, he is finishing a story he's been telling to the proprietor, Clyde, who leans across the counter. It's been an emotional story, but she is unmoved. In fact, she insistently chooses not to expend any emotion on her employees, despite the fact that they might very well be people who would welcome her caring, because, like her, they are former prisoners from the local penitentiary, and this is one of the only places that they've had a chance to find work following their release. But Clyde has not offered these ex-cons a second chance out of the softness of her heart. Despite her stern style, the characters who wash up here in Clyde's discover some unexpected hope for their futures, in their communal sufferings and support, and in the humble activity of making sandwiches, of all things. The play is Clyde's by the American playwright Lynn Nottage. Lynn Nottage is very well known in America, having won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama twice, in 2009 for her play Ruined, and in 2017 for Sweat. Clyde's was first produced on Broadway in November 2021, and according to American Theater magazine, it was the most produced play in nonprofit theaters in America the following year. So there's certainly something about this play that touches a nerve. As we record this episode, a new production is on stage at the Donmar Warehouse Theatre in London, directed by Lynette Linton, who directed Nottage's last play, Sweat, at the same theatre back in 2018. Sweat was also set in the town of Reading, and it charts the devastation that is wreaked on the community when the local factory replaces long-standing unionized employees with cheaper immigrant labor, throwing them onto the picket line and eventually out of their jobs. The stories and characters of both Sweat and this play are based on extensive local research Nottage carried out in the 2010s, and the plays certainly have the stamp of lived reality. I'm delighted to be joined today by the director, Lynette Linton, who, having directed both of these great plays, is the perfect guest to talk about Clyde's. Welcome to the Play Podcast, Lynette. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting me. What a great introduction.
Thanks. I work hard on those. Before we get into it, I must do a proper introduction. Lynette is the artistic director of the Bush Theatre in London, where she is sitting as we speak, and where she has been leading a groundbreaking program of new work that champions all types of diverse voices. We've been lucky enough to cover two of their acclaimed recent productions on the podcast, Tyrrell Williams's Red Pitch and Margaret Perry's Paradise Now. Lynette was previously resident assistant director at the Donmar, hence her involvement with Clyde's and Sweat, for which she won the Best Director Award at the Black British Theatre Awards. Her long list of directing credits includes Blues for an Alabama Sky at the National Theatre, for which she won Evening Standard and Critics' Circle Awards for Best Director, as well as Richard II at the Globe Theatre, which was distinguished for being the first ever company of women of colour on a major UK stage. She has directed or assisted on shows at the Bush, the Donmar, the Gate, the Theatre Royal Stratford East, the Royal Court, and the West End, to name just a few. So that's the formal bit over. Now, I mentioned in the introduction that Lynn based Sweat and now Clyde's on first-hand research that she did, Lynette, and I wonder, you're having worked on these two plays, if there is more insight you could share into what that research consisted of and what she was seeking to achieve in creating the plays in that way.
I think you said in your original introduction that Lynn really is about human and it's about reality. So I think that Lynn's way of working is that she will go to the spaces which these shows exist and meet people and understand their stories, so that when she's writing these characters, they're based on reality and they're based on real people. And I think that what she gets so right in a lot of her work is the humanity. And that's because she's gone out and she's done a lot of that talking and speaking. And also like kind of taking inspiration from her. When me and Frankie Bradshaw were doing Sweat, we went out to Reading, Pennsylvania as well, just to be out in the space and actually see people, meet people, and go to the bar that Sweat was set in.
Oh, great.
So that we could get some of that too, because obviously you're representing real people, you're representing stuff that happened. So you want to make sure that it's as real as possible.
That's fabulous. I mean, I loved Sweat. It was really telling as a presentation of what was happening in America with the threat to industrialization on the Rust Belt in particular, and the devastation in these people's lives who'd worked in these factories for generations. And of course, what the impact is on everyone in a town that's connected with that factory, but also personalizing those stories. And I wonder whether any of the stories actually in Sweat or in Clyde's, do these come actual stories from real people, actual language?
I think I'd use the word influence with it. So I don't think it's actual stories at all. I think it's Lynn talks to people, is influenced by people, and then she writes characters, would be the best way I'd describe it.
Okay, great. Well, it definitely has the stamp of authenticity about it, both these plays.
Yeah, I think she's one of our best living playwrights. She's just able to bring us into these worlds, but also make us fall in love with these characters in such wonderful ways. And make us care about a sandwich in Clyde's.
Yeah, well, we'll come to how we care about sandwiches.
Okay.
In fact, for listeners who are not familiar with the play or have not had the pleasure of seeing your production yet, can you give us a brief introduction to the characters and a very short summary of what goes on in the play?
Of course. So Clyde is set in a sandwich shop called Clyde's, run by Clyde. And you meet 5 characters, all who have been to prison at some point in their lives, including Clyde. We have Montrellis, who they describe as a sensei, and he sort of leads the group. You have Raphael, who is probably our charming, a bit of a joker of the group. We have Jason, who's actually a character from Sweat, who she carried over into Clyde's, which is super exciting. Also played by the same actor, Patrick Gibson. And then we have Letitia, who is a single mother who went to prison for stealing medication for her daughter.
Yes. And what we see go on is that they are given their first job back out of prison by Clyde. And what we see is them trying to put their lives back together. This is just a stopping point, a first step, because they come out of prison with virtually nothing and have the stamp of being an ex-con, so no one will hire them, but she does.
But she does.
I'm not entirely clear why she hires them. Is she just getting cheap labor?
I think so. I think that, but also she's able to tease them and treat them exactly how she wants to, because they're not going to leave. She has that wonderful scene, doesn't she, where she's just like, leave, ha ha ha, and just laughs about them leaving because she knows they're not going to get jobs anywhere else. And, you know, they speak about that, how they tried to, and how did they all end up here? And Clyde's was the only place that would give them the time of day, which is a comment, I think, on the prison system in America and in the UK, and the failures sometimes to bring people back and rehabilitate them. I don't think we do that right. So I think Lynn's making a comment on that through the play as well.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely get to that theme. But it's interesting you're saying in personal terms, it's something that gives her a power that she wouldn't otherwise have.
Exactly.
Just by way of background, she is the proprietor of the establishment, but I think she doesn't actually own it outright in the sense that she's heavily in debt to some dodgy characters.
She is, yeah. We don't know exactly.
No, we don't.
You know, she goes, I've got my investors out front and, you know, I had to do stuff, but we don't know exactly where she is. We just know that she's in a bit of trouble that she's trying to get out of, which is why she wants them to keep their heads down. So when they start getting excited about hope and what the place could become, which I suppose is one of the biggest threads of the play, them being inspired by what Clyde's could be, she's like, we've got to keep our heads down. We don't need people to know that we exist, which I think is...
Yes. I think Montrellis might actually drop a clue that she had a gambling debt, and she says she's in debt to some demons. So there's something unsavory in the background there that she's caught up in as well. Can we talk a bit about the structure of the play? Because I mentioned at the start that Montrellis is finishing telling Clyde a story. But am I right that we don't actually go on from there? We go back in time, or...
Interesting. I think that is a choice that I think the production can make, because Lynn isn't specific with that. And that scene feels like it exists standalone, doesn't it? And then you jump into understanding what goes on day to day. So that is, I think, up to the director's discretion and the actors.
Okay. I'm intrigued because, and we will come to the end at the end, of course, so I don't want to give away the end, but there is an echo of the start at the end. So there's some sense that maybe the structure of the play is that it comes full circle back to the beginning. But I mean, we could talk about that more when we get to the end.
Yeah, I think Lynn's got so many metaphors running along through it, including how Montrellis and Clyde are represented and what they stand for, as well as being the people that they are, what they represent. So there's that kind of feeling, I think, with time passing.
The other thing is that through the play, we get a brief account of each of their backstories, including the crime they committed to end up in prison. As Letitia says to Jason, it's a kind of ritual. We speak the truth. So they have this moment where we learn what's happened in the past. But I was going to ask you in structural terms, I suppose, what do you think holds the play together, the through line that connects these various characters and their stories?
I think what holds it together is, well, I think the comedy, but also Lynn's absolute talent for making us fall in love with these characters so quickly. I think that we want to know who they are. We want to know what's happened to them. They make us laugh within 5 minutes, and then you care about them. So I think that's what holds it together. And I think she does a great job of talking about politics without talking about politics. And talking about all these massive themes without them actually coming out of the characters' mouths. And I think that's the best work and the best plays, actually. So that we're following human stories, but within it we leave and we have loads of thoughts about the prison systems and about hope. So I think that's the skill of Lynn Nottage, is that she's able to hold us through her characters.
Yeah, it's a bit like what you were saying earlier, that if you think about the research and where they come from, these plays, that the characters are speaking for a whole community and also about themes that, are happening in those communities, but not explicitly. She's representing that through these characters. And I know you've written about the difference between theme and, what's your phrase?
And I mean, I just go on about it all the time. When we're working with new writers at the Bush, me and Daniel Bailey, our artistic associate director, always talk about theme versus story.
Stories versus themes. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. You might as well write me a lecture if you want to talk about, the prison system in the US. But if it's a play, there has to be a story, and then through that we can explore it. But yeah, everyone's heard me say that a lot.
But it's a great principle, because that's what happens here. We get the stories of these individuals representing bigger issues. I was thinking the drive of the play also is essentially we're watching these people struggling to come to terms with their circumstances. This is what they have in common, in practical terms, how to make something viable with their lives after prison, but also psychologically. That's the most interesting part of the play. I mean, it's telling about the practical challenges they face, but how they process what they're guilty of and rebuild their own self-worth and confidence. And our attention, I think, and the focus of the play is on what progress they're making, if any, in that quest, so to speak. We naturally hope for them, and we're looking for signs that things may turn for the better or that they may regress. So we're vigilant, I think, to that kind of agenda for all of these characters. And as you say, care about them in those personal terms.
Yeah. Montrellis says just because you've left prison doesn't mean you're out of prison, which I think is such an important line. And in our production, we have a couple of moments where the characters are in the kitchen and then they have a kind of flashback of their time in prison, which is something that I knew when I read it I was going to put in, because it's that idea of they can't escape it, even in their most heightened moments. And for some of those moments, they are heightened, they're happy, and then suddenly something snaps them back into what they've gone through. So I think you're fully right that that's part of the reason why you want to follow them, and you're hopeful that they're going to get out of this kind of trap that they're in.
That was my very next question about those moments in your production.
Oh,
that I don't believe are included in the text of the play, where they each have a brief stop action flashback. And I was going to ask you, why do we put these in? It definitely brings, I think, a sharp shock of reality. Whenever things get a little bit comfortable, you realize what they're going through, that they're carrying with them the scars of this past that they can't get rid of, that just flare up inside them, these memories.
Exactly. And I think, it's such a gift in how we can explore that theatrically. And I think it's important that because it's a comedy, you can get lost in that. But as you said, sharp reminders of actually what's happened to these people felt really important for us.
Yes, it definitely darkens the tone, I think, very effectively, because they've been through some real shit.
Yeah.
And it's not easy to leave behind. There's also, I think, a running thread through the play of Montrellis's dream that the diner could offer something more than the standard fare that's on the menu for the truckers. with his invention of special sandwiches. And he's trying to convince Clyde to back that idea. And as you said, that sort of interweaves in and out between them, that is a potential alternative future for all of them. I mean, it's not just Motrellis, but you have the sense that they would all have an opportunity to be part of this if it could happen. This could be a way forward.
There's a literal sense of that, but the metaphorical sense as well. So the literal sense that if they all work together, they can transform Clyde into something special. But then the metaphorical sense of like, this sandwich is my hope, this sandwich is my future. Like, no matter what you're making, if you put your effort into it, you put your love into it, it will succeed. And I think there's such a strong metaphor in that running along the whole play about, yes, these are literal sandwiches. Yes, this is a literal kitchen, but also it represents so much more in if you want to, and if you put the effort in, it might happen, you know?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's those two parallel lines that she's playing with that I think we play within our production with lighting and kind of like these dreamlike states where things get quite heightened when they're making the sandwiches.
Yeah, that is stunning. You're right. We'll come to the metaphors of the sandwiches particularly, yes.
Oh, sorry, I'm jumping ahead.
No, that's great. Let's talk about the characters then a bit more in detail. So Motrellis, who seems in lots of ways to be the center of this thing, there are some lovely phrases describing him, which suggest his distinctive charisma, which are beautifully embodied, by the way, in the performance of Giles Terrera. In the opening stage directions, for example, he's described as the John Coltrane of sandwich making, which is a wonderful thought. And Raphael at some point says he's like the Buddha if he'd grown up in the hood. So he's a wonderful character in the sense that he's causing wonder in his colleagues and us. There's something spiritual about him, isn't there?
Absolutely. In our version of the play, because he is literally spiritual and doesn't on paper feel like he can do no wrong, really, apart from in Clyde's eyes, we really wanted to make sure we spent a bit of time humanizing him and finding moments of not necessarily flaws, but finding moments where we see a little bit more of who he might have been before he was here. And they're just little flickers in the play, but I think Giles does that so well, where we lean into, this man is a sensei, he's a leader, but also what did he do to get here? And obviously we find out later, but we had a lot of fun exploring his backstory because he literally says, I was doing everything to, just keep food in the fridge. So what was he doing? Like, what did, what I mean? So we spent a lot of time on that timeline.
His backstory, we're desperate to know what that is, aren't we? What his crime was, because of who he is now. You want to know what his journey has been. And perhaps we imagine that his crime was even worse than the others, so that his road back to redemption would be even more impressive. That may be too predictable in some way, but you have the sense he's been through some form of profound conversion in his life along the way, haven't you?
Mm-hmm.
But back on his mesmerizing presence that Giles creates, but it's in the text as well, because it's in the language, I think. The way he is so poetic and spellbinding even. He's like a religious orator, isn't he? And the stage directions talk about him being really graceful, poetry and motion. And then the others talk about him like he's a high, holy man. And Letitia says, he knows what we only wish to know. It all sounds very philosophical and spiritual. It exudes this attitude of calm and wisdom as well, that he's come to terms with his life and what the world is as well. And he also is able to inspire them because he simply tells the others that he believes in them, gives them encouragement, which is more likely that they'll believe in themselves. Whatever's been going on in his life, it's really impressive that he's able to do that.
Absolutely. And that's what Giles is able to do so beautifully. And as you said, Lynn is set up with the language that she uses and how he speaks. I'm quite big on transitional language and making sure the story is told throughout, even when the scene's finished. So we have a couple of moments with Motrellis where we see those flickers I was mentioning. So he's able to keep it going for them, but then for himself, sometimes he has to kind of ramp himself back up. And I think that's really interesting in the sort of humanization of him as a character.
That's brilliant, because the text hasn't necessarily got very many clues to that, except there's a moment, isn't there, when they get a great review, and again on his campaign to Clyde to try and change what this can be, which is, I suppose, his dream, and she just bats it back again. He looks discouraged at this point. For one and the only times, you do think, actually, he may not be able to keep this all together, this positivity all the time for the others, as you say. Let's talk about Clyde, the other end of the scale. I mean, she's a tough cookie, isn't she? So here's my question. Why is she the way she is?
Well, That's a question that I can't answer fully because it's a backstory thing. It's a conversation with Lynn. I think Lynn tells you as much as you want to know about why she is the way she is. What me and Bemi, who plays Clyde in our production, spoke a lot about was her backstory, which we didn't share with the rest of the company because nobody knows. That's why we hear all those rumors. And then we spoke a little bit about her vulnerability, and again, to humanize her so that we could see that in our production, it's not in the text. We see a moment where she walks in and she sees Letitia and Raphael flirting. And we have a moment where she kind of yearns for that, but then decides to break it. So we also have a moment, without too many spoilers, up top on the balcony where you see her just on her own. So we decided to put a couple of moments in where she was able to give you hints at what she may have gone through. But I can't answer that question directly because I don't think you're supposed to know fully why she is the way she is. She's had a hard life, you know?
No, you're not. You're right. You don't know what she's done. And it's like there's a carapace she's putting on somehow to protect herself. And that, as you say, she's had a hard life.
You know, she says things like, don't get too high on hope. Don't get too high on hope. Don't disappoint me by having aspirations. Stop putting your lofty ideas in their head. There's all those clues of tells you that she may have been that once. She may have had a lot of dreams once. And something has happened that means that she's lost that. Or at least she's protecting herself from that because it's too painful. So we use those clues to work out who she is. You know, me and Bemi were very specific with why she was in prison, what she did. But as I said, we didn't share it with anybody.
Oh, wow. And you're not going to share it here either.
No, I'm not.
Okay, that's fair enough. That is fair enough because the writer didn't. And I think it's right not to keep us thinking about that. Why is she so hard on them? Letitia says, you've got no idea what it's like for us out here. If she's hard, believe me, that bitch probably earned that shit. What, is she talking as a woman, potentially also, what she's suffered?
She's talking as a Black woman. And I think that's important, that relationship between the two of them. Again, we tried to find a couple of moments where Clyde and Letitia had as the two Black women in that space, which is really important. Lots of hints.
Yes, because she says also, my life is a list of indignities that would make your skin crawl. Talk to me about cruelty, and I'll teach you something about perseverance. That's a fantastic line, by the way.
I know, it gives me chills.
Yeah. So she's experienced some shit. And the way she is because she's persevered. She survived in this world. And she says, this world is mean. I'm just in it. I was also intrigued, however, there's a line very early on when she says, I don't do pity. I just don't. And you know why? Because dudes like you thrive on it. What does she mean by that?
Again, that is maybe part of her backstory. Who knows? Well, it's interesting, isn't it, when you think of her relationships with the men in the play, Raphael and Jason particularly, and how that develops throughout the show. And this idea of, I don't do pity, because men thrive on that. And then we see that relationship with Jason as well actually play out in front of us. But yes, I think it's all part of what she's been through. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay. Well, I wondered also partly, was it about whether she sees that all of them feel sorry for themselves, that life has dealt them an unfair deal, and that things have not been their fault. And pity would corroborate that for them. Mm-hmm. So she means, in a sense, you just got to own up to responsibility.
Yeah.
And as Letitia said at some point, everyone was responsible for my unhappiness except me.
Yeah, that's a great line as well.
Given all this, we have these suspicions or questions about what her past is, and is there a soft center in her? Maybe that's the too predictable trope, that we are waiting to see whether there'll be a moment where she reveals that she has a heart after all.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But Lynn plays with that beautifully, and your production does, because there's this fantastic moment, isn't there, where Montrellis tries to get her to take a bite of his classic created sandwich to try and seduce her into going along with his idea for the new menu. And she looks like she's just about to do so, and then throws it on the ground.
And the reaction every night to that from the audience is amazing. You just literally jump out of your seat like, what are you doing? Everybody is.
Yeah. And we're all suckered in. We all think, oh, this is the moment. And no, bang.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, talking about Letitia, she appears to be strong and self-possessed, but she's dealing with some big challenges, isn't she?
She really is, yeah. She's got her ex, Keith. She's got her daughter who's not very well. And that relationship and being worried about leaving her daughter in his care. And the way that plays out, I think, is super. It is just beautiful writing from Lynn and wonderful acting from Ronke. And then obviously this relationship with Raphael,
Uh-huh.
which is a flirty thing. I won't say much more about that because I wouldn't want to ruin it for people that watch it. But that relationship and what that is and what they mean to each other. And also her relationship with Montrellis, which I think is gorgeous in how he's able to soothe her and help her and guide her. But yeah, she's got a lot going on. And as Montrellis says, she brings all the chaos into the kitchen. So she's not able to kind of go, let me leave that out there, let me come to work. And him trying to coach her through how that might work if she was able to.
Oh, it's no surprise, though, what she's dealing with.
Yeah.
And again, a relatively light touch from Lynn in the play, because you don't get all the details, but you get enough to know what the burdens are. She's a single mother of a child who needs special care. In the text, it refers to a specific disease that she has, her daughter, which is actually just horrific. And all it says is that she requires operating medical equipment at home, the babysitter. So that just gives you some insight into the scale of the challenge she has. And of course, an ex who's predictably unreliable. We don't know exactly what he gets up to, except he's not there when she needs him to be, generally.
No, we just know he smokes weed and he doesn't feed her properly, the daughter, because she has that moment where she's like, can you feed her some proper food, please?
That's great.
Yeah, but you kind of go, she can't even trust him with his own child. So,
well, no wonder she's carrying all these problems with her. But she has this great line as well at one stage when she says, being incarcerated taught me two things. Number one, I love freedom. And number two, you have to fight to protect your freedom. It seems to me it's like a cry to be free from dependency on others as well. For example, like unreliable men. Which carries through potentially to her caution with Raphael, who holds a candle for her, because she says, ain't nobody ever done something nice for me. I don't want to be disappointed. So, men haven't been too good, I think, for her in the past. But yes, so Raphael, without giving too much away, let's talk a little bit about him and their relationship. He's a sweetheart, isn't he?
He's a sweetheart. He's just the sweetest guy. As you said, holds candle for Letitia. He was an addict, but he's been clean for about a year when we meet him. So that's really good. And I'm about to say why he was sent to prison. All I'm going to say is because he robbed a bank, but I'm not going to give details because I think that's one of the best speeches in the play.
It is. Suffice to say that he makes a pathetic hash of it.
Yes. Yeah, you can say that.
For sort of naive and honorable reasons.
Yeah.
But you also fear, because he's a nice guy, right? We fear that he's going to get derailed at some point, do we not? That he may be the most vulnerable of them.
Yeah, agreed. But what I loved about what Lynn does and what she subtly suggests here, and which I think we played on in our production, was his relationship with Montrellis and how Montrellis is helping to keep him on the straight and narrow, how much he looks up to him. That lovely speech he has about Montrellis going to prison on principle.
Yes.
and how when Montrellis is in the space, he can get through the day. And Letitia, I think he relies on both of them. But yeah, you do have a sense that something might go wrong, but you're really hoping it doesn't for him.
Well, he's really reliant on the others, on each other. They're really relying on each other. And he's desperate for Montrellis's respect.
He is.
When they're trying to invent their own sandwiches, he's desperate for his approval. I hope he makes it.
Yeah.
I think he will. There's a classic moment when things go a little bit wrong with Letitia. And it's not that original, but it's still inevitably, unbelievably heartbreaking to watch, isn't it?
It is. I love what you just said about you hope he makes it. I think that's what's so wonderful about these characters is that after it finishes, you still want to know. You want to be like, what? Where are they now?
Oh, well, we'll come to that. What about Jason? You mentioned that we've met him before in Lynn's earlier play, Sweat. Could you give us a little background about his story from Sweat? Because we pick up with him here from what happened to him previously, don't we?
We do. That was such an interesting character to revisit because I knew him so well. It was really interesting as a director to go into a space where I really knew that character. I'd spent a lot of time with him. And then to have the same actor come back, which was a dream because Patrick is Paddy, I call him. So Paddy used to work at the factory that he got locked out of the factory, and him and his friend, obviously the story is much more complicated than this and is in the play Sweat. So if you haven't read Sweat, I'm just going to say to people, it is a stunning piece of work and it's just such an important piece of work and so wonderfully written to read it. I think you can imagine it in your head. But Jason and his friend Chris get drunk one night after they've been out of work for quite a long time and attack one of the people that are now working in the factory.
A scab.
Yeah, I hate that word.
Yeah.
That's what he calls him. And he uses that word again in this play, which I think is also really interesting in terms of his progression. And they attack this young man, but also in the crossfire, someone else gets hit, with this baseball bat that they use and has brain damage and is very, very ill after that. So he goes down for aggravated assault, spends quite a lot of time in prison, and then we meet him just as he's come out. And we decided to set Clyde in 2008. So it was literally directly after the scenes that you see in Sweat. So a little Easter egg for anybody that saw our production of Sweat, he's in the same hoodie that he wears at the end of the show. No one in the world will know that apart from me, Paddy and Frankie, our designer. But we really wanted to keep the through line. So we set it in 2008. He's in that jumper and it's literally like he's just had this moment, and because he lives out, camps outside, so he's dirty and he's still in the same clothes.
I love that detail of continuity.
Yeah.
I'm ashamed to say I did not pick it up, but that's brilliant. Thank you for that background. So Jason is the only white character, it's important to say, in the play. And he's also covered in tattoos, some of which are racist in nature.
Yes.
Which he got when he was in prison. In fact, Chris, you mentioned his friend back in Sweat was black. So something happened to him in prison that he's now got racist tattoos. And of course, that means he's initially not welcomed by the rest of the team. But he says at one point the tattoos are marks that say that he was trying to survive. I thought that's a great detail.
Yeah. I mean, we did a lot of work again on what may have happened to him in prison and what may have made him get those tattoos. But we also spoke a lot about accountability. So not making an excuse, putting that stuff on his face, the racist, white supremacist tattoos on his face was a choice. So he had a choice. And we spoke a lot about that word choice. He chose to put those on his face. Even if his reasoning for that was because he wanted to survive, he still chose to go down that route. We didn't want to minimize how horrific that is to put that stuff on your face. So we spent a lot of time working out what that journey would have been for him and how he feels about it now. So when he walks into this space, he says, he's got a couple of moments where he says, I know when you see me, sometimes I forget, I've got all this on my face. And that word choice comes into the play so much, right? In terms of the choice to do what they do towards the end.
Well, yeah, the choices they made when they got into trouble and the choices that they're now going to be faced with. But Jason, I guess getting that tattoos, you can imagine, was for some self-protective thing in prison. And that, as you say, he's not allowed to evade this. But he's also, you have the sense that he's sorry, and he's certainly suffering from the fact that people are judging him, inevitably and rightly. Initially, we don't get a lot out of him. He's covering up a lot of personal pain with sullenness and a bit of bravado. And you do fear that he may explode again at some moment because, he said he let his anger get ahead of him in the original crime. And he gets taunted by Clyde and the others to some degree. And you just think this could go bad as well at some moment. He just wants to stay out of everyone's way because he talks about walking down the street and everyone's hating him and judging him. And you mentioned that he's living off grid, so to speak, in a tent out in the woods because he doesn't want to be stuck in the shelter. He doesn't want to have to deal with everybody. He's happier away from their judgments and having to talk to other people, which is a pretty sad place to be, isn't it? And it's really painful to see how abject he is about himself, about what he did in the past, because there is a moment when he breaks down telling Montrellis about his crime and how sorry he is. And I went back to Sweat, actually, Lynette, and this is another connection I thought, which was brilliant. There's a speech near the end of Sweat when Jason's struggling with what he's done in his anger at himself and others, and his parole officer says, "Most folk says it's the guilt or rage that destroys us in the end. But I know from experience that it's shame that eats us away until we disappear." That seems to speak for Jason and even the others at times, doesn't it? Shame.
It's so wonderful that you brought that speech up because that, again, was one of my favorite moments in Sweat. Even as you said it, I get chills because I spent less time with these plays, but it's so wonderful. And a lot of people that watch Sweat came out talking about that speech and how as humans, no matter what we've gone through, that is so true. You get eaten up by shame. So yes, absolutely. And that's why it's just so beautiful. And I keep urging people that saw Sweat to see Clyde because even though it's a comedy, so you go, oh, it's a completely different genre. Sweat was not a comedy. The parallels and what she's talking about and the continuation of those themes and how they're wrapped up in those characters. You can literally see that in Jason, can't you?
Absolutely. I think maybe it's how you sell the show in some ways, I suppose. But the idea that it's about sandwiches and this sort of thing, which we'll come to in just a second, maybe just slightly misleads you in terms of that this is a light piece. And actually, you shouldn't overlook the fact that it has this connection to Sweat. It's the same themes running through it. Let's just switch gears a little bit now. We talked a bit about the characters. We can't talk about this play without talking about the food. It's phenomenal, firstly, to watch your show in action because the cast are making real sandwiches throughout, chopping and throwing ingredients together at a manic pace. But what I also love are the descriptions of the sandwiches that each of the characters invents.
Oh, yeah.
This is food porn.
It is, yeah.
Isn't it? The language is wonderful, isn't it? It must have been a challenge actually dealing with the practicalities of all this food making, but the language is fantastic.
It is amazing, the language of the food, but yes, the practicalities of actually putting it together. So I was prepared for it, but also until you do it, you don't really know.
Yeah.
Because they've got real knives on stage. They have real ingredients on stage. They are having to prep sandwiches while have a long speech. You know, until you're in that space and you're doing the choreography of that, the foodography, it's unlike anything that you've ever expected.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking it was a nightmare for health and safety and the stage management, I have to say.
Yeah. I mean, big up our stage management because the team were wonderful. It's such a massive undertaking, actually. And then on top of that, we've got moving counters as well. So it's just like all of the components that you could get so wrong. You know, we did knife training and they spent some time in kitchens because it's such a process. And, you know, Raphael's frying as well, and grilling, and there's just so much going on all the time. But I think that really adds to the experience. And I think if we were trying to fake it, it just wouldn't have been as powerful. You want to smell the onions, you want to smell the cheese. And that what we keep saying is don't come and see it if you're hungry because it will just make you hungry.
Yeah. It also anchors the reality of it too, doesn't it?
And also that means that when we lean into the theatricality of it, it can fly, right? So what you said about the poetry of the language, I think is really important because in our production, once Montrellis starts to really explore that language, the space around him shifts. So the poetry kind of bursts into the space. Our tables start to move, the lights start to change, things start to light up differently. So it's not naturalistic anymore. And that comes because of the poetry of the language.
Oh, that's a brilliant connection because you have both the reality of these tubs of ingredients that you see in a sandwich shop and they're diving in with their hands, throwing the lettuce around, but also the poetic movement, particularly Montrellis, when he's making a sandwich with this kind of exaggerated fluency. It's just poetry in motion, as the stage directions say. And the language is just reverent, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I can't resist quoting the ingredients that make up one of their sandwiches that they invent. This one is Maine lobster, potato roll gently toasted and buttered with roasted garlic, paprika and cracked pepper with truffle mayo, caramelized fennel, and a sprinkle of dill. I'm not an actor, but boy, language is irresistible.
It's interesting that you chose that. It's interesting you chose that one because that's the one that we use to space to start moving. That's the piece of ingredients. When he's telling us of that, they start to move around him.
So there is poetry in that then.
There is.
But as Raphael says, it ain't just about the sandwich. What more does the making and inventing of sandwiches signify?
Oh, well, it signifies so much. I think Montrellis has the lines, which I'm going to say wrong, where he talks about, when I made this sandwich is my peace, this sandwich is my freedom, this sandwich is my...
Strength.
There you go.
And victory.
I
looked it up. The sandwich is my strength, this sandwich is my victory, this sandwich is my freedom.
And I think that really, for me, sums up, not completely, because there's so many metaphors in the play, but I think that is such an interesting kind of rally cry in going, no matter what you're doing, no matter what it is, use what you're doing to guide your life. You know what I thought when I made that sandwich? This sandwich is my freedom. Like, I'm here and I'm making a sandwich. I'm not in prison anymore. I'm here making a sandwich. This is my freedom. And the person that's going to taste that is going to taste my love, is going to taste my creativity. And you start to frame something as simple, I'd say, as a sandwich like that. And then it becomes the most magical thing in the world, which I think is Lynn saying that you can do that with anything, right? And, you know, when he talks about Letitia's special sauce, like use it and make it a drop of love for her daughter, all of the sort of metaphorical language that comes around that, it means that she's talking about hope. She's talking about second chances. She's talking about looking at what you've been given and seeing it differently, which I think is what these characters, they could just, you know, when we meet Jason and he's like, I've already had a rubbish day and everything's annoying and everything's bad and this place is a dump. He says that quite a lot, doesn't he? And then by the end of the play, we see a bit of a transformation on how he sees things too. And I think that's one of the comments Lynn is making about what you can do with what you're handed. And it's not easy at all. It's really difficult for these characters, but just sort of changing the viewpoint might help you.
Thinking differently about the way you see something. That's such a powerful concept. Very hard to do.
Very hard to do.
you're right that Marcella's saying that this is his freedom. It's a statement of independence of some kind from everything attached to his past and other people's expectations, that this is something he can control. So there's elements in metaphoric terms of control and order that they haven't had much of in their lives. Creativity, obviously, because they have this running challenge of making their own sandwich. So that gives them some outlet for self-expression, something to take pride in, because they're so desperate to rebuild, I think, in some senses, their self-worth. We talked about the shame before. So it gives them some foundation to be able to move on and define themselves differently in a more positive way. And also, Trellis, he's Zen-like, isn't he? He's got this fantastic line, is all you can do is control the intention. And the result ultimately isn't, somebody else marking the result, whatever, it isn't the most important thing. There's so much wisdom around the sandwiches, isn't there?
Yeah, and he's got another lovely line that I'm going to say wrong again, but where he says, my hand, where I show you may not be where your hand goes. Where I lead may not be where your hand ends up, or something like that, he says, when he's talking to Jason. And Jason says, can you show me how to make that sandwich? Which I also think is such an interesting line in terms of, yes, I can show you, but actually you need to do the work to get there.
Yes.
I can lead you, but are you going to follow? You know what I mean? And I think that's also, particularly for a character like Jason, where he's testing him and being like, you're not going to come into this straight away, you need to get there, which was a really lovely conversation between Paddy and Giles and what that relationship is.
Yes, and it would take him some time because he's got to feel it from inside as well.
Exactly.
And just to mine the metaphor even further, talk about the ingredients of their life. Because there's a line somewhere, isn't there, to Letitia about including something unexpected that shouldn't work, but that pulls it all together. Maybe that's Raphael, eh?
No, we'll see. We'll see.
You're not going to give anything away. You're not giving anything away.
No.
Okay, we talked about stories versus themes. And clearly one of the big themes behind its play is how the prison system and our societies work or don't work in the way offenders re-enter society. And I wondered what you thought the play says about that particular theme.
That's a big question. I think it's saying a lot of things. We did a lot of research in the room. We had people come in and talk to us. I think the rehabilitation in both countries, in the UK and the US, and how we get people who've been to prison back to work, how we view them as a society. So that's media. I think there's a lot of work to be done here in terms of the whole conversation around second chances. If you've made a mistake and you've gone to prison for whatever reason, and obviously there's different degrees of crime. So I will say that as well. But I do think that we have a real negative outlook in how, if someone says they've been to prison, automatically we're like, oh, okay, oh, no, not going to go there. But yes, so I think Lynn's making comments about all of that without specifically slapping us on the head and saying, this is how you should feel. Because I think you go into this space and you may judge who these characters are, and then you get to know them and they're the opposite. And I think that's what Lynn's work does so beautifully. But I think it's also commenting on how far both countries, the UK and the US, have to go with that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's some great stuff in the program that accompanies your production that the Donmar published about the fact that, 75% of former prisoners in the US penal system are back in prison within 5 years. And the way the prison system should work, that this isn't just a temporary removal of the guilty from society, but that they actually end up being tarred thereafter as well, that we don't give them an equal chance after they come out. And as you say, also, there's a fascinating piece in that program that makes us understand that not every prisoner in prison is an evil monster, that these are compassionate, intelligent human beings who've made mistakes. And as Montreal says, we ain't bound by our mistakes, or at least shouldn't be, of course. Well, we could talk for a long time about all those themes on the prison, and I know your time is short, but I want to jump just finally, Lynette, to the ending. You said in an interview that ultimately we leave with hope. What happens is that there's a showdown between Montrellis and Clyde, and he won't back down. He takes his apron off and walks out, having made, again, one of his perfect sandwiches, and leaves it there. And the others go with him. Now, we don't know where they're going. The implication is they're quitting this job and striking out into the world. Why do you say that we leave with hope at that point?
I think we leave with hope because we've watched an hour and 35 minutes of these characters understanding what this sandwich means to them, that there may be more for them, that collectively they're powerful, and that actually to make the perfect sandwich, as Letitia talks about what makes the perfect sandwich, all of them are needed. So the metaphor of that is that they collectively all make it together towards the end. So the power in community. In our production, Montrellis leaves, and we actually played about with this. We played about with the idea of, does he leave and wait for them? You know, do they see him wait, or does he leave and then they choose to leave after him? And that might sound like such a little detail, but it's so important. Is it their choice to go, or are they following their leader? And we decided that it's got to be their choice. We've got to see, he goes and he offers that, and he's like, let's see, is his last line. So he's not even offering anything concrete in that sense. He's offering hope. And so he leaves, and then we see the three of them come to their individual choices, take a breath together, and with that they're released, I think. And I think there's something in what we try to do in our production where they're released from what we spoke about before, how they're being kind of trapped by their memories, and how that sort of, when you don't leave just because you've left prison. So we tried to create the opposite of that in this moment of them coming together in community, means that they can take a breath and leave the space. So for me, it's a very, very hopeful ending. And then obviously you've got, I'm not going to say what happens with Clyde after the four of them leave, because that really does ruin the ending. But also that moment, I think, might give a little bit of hope too.
Well, I think whatever their practical challenges, which still remain, we feel that they are psychologically better prepared to meet them, don't we? Partly through their own development, as you said, their release of their past and the support that they have found working together. That's fantastic stuff. Okay, one last thing. Before you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might cover in the podcast, or one that's just a personal favorite. Now, I know this is iniquitous to a director of a theater, but could you just give us one play that you love that we could share with listeners?
I'm obviously going to say something that's coming up at the Bush. I'm sorry. But I'm going to say two plays that are coming up at the Bush in the new year. So we have Shifters, which is a play that I'm directing. It's a beautiful love story between two characters who we see their whole life and whether they end up together. That's coming up in February. It's going to be really great. And then The Chord, which is a story of fatherhood, that is in the main space after that. So that first one's by Benny, and the second Chord is by Bijan, and they are wonderful plays. They're coming back to the Bush for their second shows, and we're super, super excited. So come through and see some beautiful new writing.
That's the great plug. Thank you very much. Okay, Lynette's wonderful production of Clyde's continues at the Donmar Warehouse until the 2nd of December. But if there's any justice in the world, it should have a longer life with a transfer to the West End.
Yeah.
You can also listen to our review of the show on the Play Review podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, or at www.theplaypodcast.com. As the four unlikely sandwich makers strike out on their own to wherever their next steps take them, what do we hope or fear for them? The odds are still stacked against them, mainly because of our general judgment that ex-offenders remain a perpetual danger to society, or at least in some way not worthy of an equal chance. Can they overcome these huge challenges? To do so begins with their finding their own self-belief, perhaps from someone else who also believes in them. Those are the essential ingredients. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.